Today, I'm going to give a discussion on the topic of sexual misbehavior in the church community. I put misbehavior in quotes because I think there's a very broad spectrum of how we view sexual assault. I think there's a lot of denial that's involved in the church. I think there's a lot of minimizing. So I'm just interested in educating people about what's really out there. I think people would be incredulous to find out some of the things that go to court um, in the arena of sexual assault. So we're going to talk about trigger warning. Today, we're going to have a very frank discussion about sexual behavior in the church. It's going to be graphic. I'm not going to pull any punches. When I was talking to my son about this presentation, I said, do you think I should soft pedal it? And he said, the church has been pulling its punches for the last several decades. He goes, I think you need to have a frank discussion. So we're going to. Some of you may find this disturbing, and I actually think that's a good thing, because if you think about it, it's a disturbing topic. And if you don't want to be disturbed about it, it means you're in denial maybe, and you just don't want to deal with it, which most people don't want to deal with child sexual abuse. Some of you, it's been mentioned that in our group, I feel quite sure there have been people who have been victims of child sexual abuse, and this may be triggering. If that's the case, I've put a phone number here for the sexual abuse hotline if you want to discuss it. There's also a website called RAINN, RAINN.org, that has free counseling and free 24/7 support for victims of sexual assault. If you feel that this whole discussion is too disturbing, I've been told that it's going to be recorded and presented later on YouTube. And there's some of you who may feel more comfortable in seeing it that way. I'm going to paint several scenarios about sexual assault, but before I do, I'm just going to give you a quick background about my exposure to this topic. I was a prosecutor in San Mateo County, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, for 18 years. And one of my assignments was in the sexual assault unit. After I left the DA's office, district attorney's office, I went to Monterey Bay Academy, which is one of our Adventist academies, and worked as the development director, raising money for the school. And one of my assignments there each year was to give a sexual harassment presentation to the staff. After that, I returned to practicing law. I opened my own practice, and I worked with abused and neglected children, including children who had been victims of sexual abuse. So that's my background. I just want to talk to you about prosecuting sexual assault cases. And statistically, I was surprised to find out that it's about 4% of cases that are actually where convictions are obtained. So even though it goes through the process, if you go to the RAINN website that I put on the prior slide, it will tell you that 98% of sexual assault perpetrators will go free. They will never face any type of incarceration. For every 1,000 sexual assaults there are, only 50 of them are going to be reported and lead to arrest. Only 29 cases will be prosecuted as felonies, and of those, only 25 will secure convictions. So that's a very low rate. Just to put it in perspective, though, there are other crimes that are also very low in prosecution. And I was surprised to hear that. So I have a little thing here. 6.6% of motor vehicle thefts, 11.9% of burglaries, 20% of animal cruelty, 22% of arson, 24% of robberies. So it's not like there's a super high percentage of cases that are reported. Whoops, I want to go back one. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to talk to you about 4 different scenarios, and these are not actual cases, but they're kind of a compilation of cases that I've worked on in the past or have been familiar with. A child in the church has been molested. The second one is a teacher in the Adventist school system is sexually touching one of his students. A youth pastor is having sex with one of the youth in his youth group. It's a 14-year-old girl. And the last one is the pastor has child pornography on his computer. And the question I'm going to ask you is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about these things? I had talked to Lauren about putting up a survey, and he said he's had difficulty running the surveys. So I'm just going to ask you to put your answer in the chat, either a number 1, 2, 3, or 4. The first option, number 1, is call a special church board meeting. The second one is assign a committee to investigate the allegations. Number 3 is contact the conference office. And number 4 is call the police. So let me just take a moment and have you put your answers in the chat. And Linda, I'm going to ask you for a quick recap on what the answers are.
Yeah, Gina, it's all 4s.
All 4s.
This is a smart group.
That's encouraging because that's the answer.
This is a smart group.
Call the police. Every scenario that I described involves a crime because someone has been harmed and the harm may either continue or spread to others. It's the fastest response, and these people are trained professionals. Now, some people have reluctance to call the police, and we'll talk about that. But it is the fastest response. I'm going to give you a case here. This is our first case we're going to discuss, and that's a child in the church is molested. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Here's the child. You can see him sitting in the pew. He's in the primary division, so he's probably about 8 years old, 7 years old. And he is in the Sabbath school class, and they're singing a song that we used to sing when I was in Sabbath school, and my kids used to sing when they were in Sabbath school. I'm not sure if they do it anymore, but it's dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. He hears that song and he decides that he is going to take a stand, and he tells his Sabbath school teacher that his father has been molesting him. Now, he doesn't use the term molest because he doesn't know that word, but he describes behavior that the father is actually touching his sexual organs in inappropriate ways, and he reports that to his Sabbath school teacher. So she immediately tells the pastor. The pastor decides to take it up at Tuesday's church board meeting. The church board confronts the father, who denies doing anything wrong. And because he's an elder and he's a wonderful Christian, they don't do anything. How is the child impacted? And in each of the scenarios we're going to talk about today, and in all of our discussions today, I want our focus to be based on the impact it has on the victim. I think oftentimes we talk about, the church will get sued or the church is going to have to pay a lot of money. We don't care about that today. We're going to just talk about the victim and the impact it has on the victim. So the first thing I want to talk about here is delay. So when the pastor takes it up at the Tuesday board meeting, we're already days into this because he reported it at Sabbath school. So has anybody communicated with the child during that time? Or is he just laid bare with nothing and knows nothing about it? So there is also some delay from the time the church board hears about it and the time that they get together with the father. If they approach the father and tell him they want to talk to him about something, it's very possible he may say, I'm busy, I can't make it to the next meeting. And it could be 2 or 3 weeks before the father is ever brought before the church board. Again, the child is totally stressed out. Nobody's communicated with him, and he's feeling very vulnerable. The father now denies the allegations, but he's aware of what they are, and he's aware that his son has ratted him out. At this point, the danger to the child has increased, and it's very possible that he could be at some kind of risk here. After the church decides that this man is not worthy of doing anything about, and they do nothing, the molesting behavior continues, and the trust in the church is gone. So I just wanted to share an example of a case that I had when I was a prosecutor. there was a little girl who was 4 years old, had reported that her father was molesting her. And the police got involved and came out and talked to the father, who denied up and down that there was nothing wrong with this. And they decided that he had done nothing. They decided that it was going to be difficult for the case to be prosecuted. They believed the father, honestly, because he was so adamant, thought there was just confusion. And so nothing happened. So fast forward 2 years, and the little girl she's now 6 years old, had a urinary tract infection, and her mother took her to the doctor. They did a urine sample, and in the sample, they found sperm. Guess who? It was the dad that the police had believed, who so adamantly denied the molest. So think about, if you do nothing, it's very likely you've given a green light to the molester, and the molestation will continue. Have the pastor and the church board broken the law? Mandatory reporter requirements in all 50 states and most countries have laws which require clergy, teachers, counselors, Pathfinder leaders, childcare workers to report abuse. For some reason, our church kind of has a habit of not reporting abuse. So I'm asking this under a food for thought question, and it's something I want you to think about, and maybe we can take up in the chat. Why is there reluctance to call the police? And why isn't there the same reluctance to call the police for other crimes? Now, I understand that everybody put a 4 down in their survey response, but based on what I've seen in the church and articles I've read about the church, I don't think that's a very common response of calling the police. I think there's a real tendency to address things in-house. But I wonder if there would be the same reluctance to call the police for other crimes. For example, if the church burned down, would you expect the church board to do the arson investigation? Or if a child reported that the father had killed the mother, would the church board do an investigation for the homicide? I mean, I think you can see as you escalate this that it's pretty ridiculous. I mean, church boards don't have the training or experience to do a thorough investigation where it involves child victims. I'm going to give you some statistical information. 1 in 6 children will be molested. I've also seen 1 in 4 children. So that's about where we're at. 1 in every 4 to 6 children will be molested. And if you have an idea that a molester is a guy in the park wearing a trench coat and a hat and sleazing around with young kids, I'm going to disabuse you of that notion, because 90% of children know who their abusers are. Typically, it's a family member. It's dad, it's grandpa, it's Uncle John. And I'm using men here, and I know that there are female molesters, but in my experience in working as a prosecutor for 18 years, I can only think of 1 female that came to us for prosecution. It's a very low percentage. It's over 90% of abusers are men. So just out of, I guess, that tradition, I'm going to use male examples as perpetrators here. However, I do know of others who have been molested. I know of a woman who was molested by her mother and never reported it. So it's definitely a possibility. Pastors, teachers, principals, coaches, Pathfinder leaders. I'm including music instructors, also driver's education teachers, people who are teachers who have a one-on-one shot at a child. Sometimes they seek out jobs like this to give them one-on-one contact with a child. Something you may not have thought about is parents of your child's friends. And I want to just say, I wish I had a nickel for every police report I read where there was a sleepover, which I hate, where a dad uses the bathroom in the middle of the night and then somehow gets lost on the way back to his own bedroom and ends up in the room where all the girls are sleeping and molests one of the children. This is not uncommon. So parents of your child's friends. Just think about the fact that a perpetrator may also be a minor. Maybe it's a neighborhood kid who's underage. Maybe it's a sibling who's older. Maybe it's somebody who's a bully, and this is their way of bullying a child. And I also want you to expand your mind to think that the perpetrator may be someone of the same gender. And that has its own difficulties because the person who is the victim of the crime may have huge questions about their own sexuality and a deeper sense of shame, particularly in a church that talks in a bad way about homosexuality. Why would a child report sexual abuse? The main reason is they want it to stop. It's something they can't control, and it's a cry for help. They want someone to protect them. If you're living in a home where there's sexual abuse going on, think about how few options you have. How do you get away from it? You can't support yourself. You're a little kid. You're pretty much stuck there. This is the family you've been born into, and what do you do about it? They're concerned that there may be huge implications for their family that they set in motion, and they have no control over what's going to happen, and they're afraid of that. They may be embarrassed. They feel ashamed. They feel guilty. They've heard stories about Adam and Eve naked in the garden and feeling ashamed of being naked. And they don't know how to deal with their body parts, and they feel shame. So they aren't going to tell anybody. And the next one is they have no life experience on how to process this. You know, if you're a little kid, 6 years old, you don't know what sex is. You don't know anything about sex. You don't have the words to describe it. You don't know if it's normal, abnormal. You're kind of always looking to your parents for cues about what's appropriate or inappropriate behavior. So if one of your parents is molesting you in particular, you don't know what to do with this. At home, there's no discussion of sex. There's no discussion of sex in the church. Where they go to school, nobody talks about sex. The last one is kind of confusing, and that is maybe they have affection toward the perpetrator. Maybe it's their dad that they go to football games with. Maybe it's their dad that they watch television with. Maybe it's their dad that reads them stories and loves them. And then there's this weird behavior. And he says it's love. He says he's loving you in the best way he can. But for some reason, it just doesn't feel right. So maybe they have affection toward the perpetrator. The second case we're going to talk about is the teacher who is sexually touching a student. This is a middle school child that's being touched. The teacher is a male teacher in the Seventh-day Adventist school. The child is 12 years old, and the teacher gets her into his office and starts massaging her. I actually had asked if anybody had any comments to reach out to me, and somebody did and told me about an incident involving their child who had been in an Adventist school, and the teacher would act very odd verbally, and it was bullying, honestly, to get the child to start crying. And then he would take the child in the office and want to console her by rubbing her arms and touching her physically, which made her very uncomfortable. And at some point she reported it, and it turned out there were 5 other students that he'd been doing this to. So the church, of course, didn't call the police, but they moved him on to another school and got rid of him there. So, I mean, the teacher is sexually touching a student here. What is the right thing to do? And I think you all know the right thing to do, which is call the police. What did the church do in this situation? Well, they didn't call the police, but they contacted the conference Department of Education. And the Department of Education superintendent said, ugh, they know this guy. In fact, they had him at a prior school where he engaged in the same type of behavior. But they'd moved him on, and that's where he is now, doing the same kind of thing. But they decide that it's April, school is almost out. They're going to keep a close eye on him and transfer him at the end of the school year. The conference then says this is a confidential matter and they don't want anybody discussing anything about it. So I ask you, what's wrong with this picture? Well, let's talk about this. First of all, the child remains at risk. The teacher's still there. The child still has to go to class with this teacher every day. If it's like most Adventist middle schools I attended, you don't have three middle school teachers to choose from. You have one. So if that person is the perpetrator, you're stuck with them through the end of the year. And how uncomfortable is it to stay in class with this person who has been sexually touching you? There's the possibility that other children have been abused or will continue to be abused, or if they haven't been abused yet, they will be abused. The parents who reported this to the principal feel betrayed by the school. They feel betrayed by the church, and it just leaves a huge bad taste in their mouth that people still talk about 10 or 20 years later. The principal is a mandated reporter. He didn't report it to the police, and he's now subject to prosecution. The church faces liability because they knew about this guy. They moved him the last time he did it, and they are going to move him again. So the next time he molests a child, yes, they will probably be sued, and maybe these parents will sue the church. And the church liability is something that they're very concerned about. But I want to ask you, what about the victim? Let's just disregard the idea of church liability and protecting the church or shielding it from monetary loss. What about this child? What about the trust of the church? It's all dissipated. When the conference officials say, this is a confidential matter, who does the confidentiality protect? I hear an open mic here. The confidentiality protects the perpetrator. It doesn't protect the victim. And maybe when I was a kid and growing up in the 60s and 70s in Adventist schools, these confidential orders might have worked. But today, where everybody's got a cell phone and everybody's on TikTok and Instagram, there's no such thing as confidentiality. And the church is kidding itself if it thinks that they're going to keep this a secret. In the olden days, it was just gossiped about, and that was bad enough. It's better to hear reality that happened and discuss it from what it is. The other problem with this picture with the teacher that gets moved on from place to place is this repeat offender will have no record. That's a problem because everybody wants to do background checks on everyone who comes into their employ. But if it's a scenario like this and the person has no record, you've got no heads up when they apply for employment at your school. So that's something you need to be worried about. The next case scenario we're going to talk about is a youth pastor is having a sex with a 14-year-old girl in his youth group. She is a girl who has a single mom. She's being raised in a single parent household. So she's got a lot of time alone in the afternoons when her mother's still working. She's not very popular. She doesn't wear the latest fashions. She's kind of on a tight budget in her house. The other kids don't think she's that fun. They don't think she's very, somebody they really want to hang out with. But suddenly this youth pastor takes an interest in her. And he's very friendly to her. He's very kind to her. And then it kind of moves into where he's being flirtatious with her. And so suddenly she starts wearing makeup and he starts kissing her and he starts groping her. And now she's wearing sexier clothes and he tells her that he likes that. And next thing you know, they're having sex. And she realizes that this is not appropriate. He's 25 years old. She tells her mother. Her mother reports it to the senior pastor. What happens here? Well, the youth pastor had previously reported to the senior pastor that the girl was dishonest and that she'd been a behavior problem. And the church pastor noted that the girl had been wearing provocative clothing and a lot of makeup. She had jewelry. She had been putting purple streaks in her hair. And she'd been sexually acting out. And that meant she was posing, making sexual poses and posting them on her Instagram and TikTok accounts. Well, after this came forward, the youth pastor was confronted by the senior pastor and he denied everything. He was very charismatic. He's a very charming individual. And the baptisms of the young people in his youth group had increased dramatically. So what did the church do? Before I go to the next slide, I'm just going to ask you, what should the church have done? And can I see you mouth the answer? Should have called the police. They should have called the police, but they didn't. The senior pastor contacted the conference president. The conference had a policy to either terminate the youth pastor or put him on leave in order to take him away from the children. The senior pastor conceded that he had misgivings about the girl's honesty. It was a he said, she said situation. Concerns were raised about due process for the youth pastor. The youth pastor is the brother-in-law of the conference president. They choose not to follow the policy, but instead decided to counsel the girl about her dress, about her makeup, and her sexualized behaviors. So for the women who are in the audience here, I don't know how many of you had to get down on your knees and see if your skirts touched the ground, or were cautioned about different articles of clothing that you wore. During my day, it was always short skirts. But this is just more of the same, letting the girl know that it's her fault. Whose fault is it here? Who was the focus of the decision-making of this group that got together and decided to keep the youth pastor on? What should the senior pastor and the conference president have done? They should have called the police. And the consequences of their actions are, the message sent to the girl is, it's your fault. And honestly, this was very commonplace, probably 10 years before I started prosecuting sexual assault cases, that it was attack the victim. You know, what was she wearing? How was she acting? Was she flirtatious? Was she leading him on? And this was a very common defense for people who were charged with sexual crimes. In California, they changed the law to where you were no longer allowed to do that. And what the girl was wearing, and this was not a fertile area of cross-examination any longer. What message was sent to the youth pastor? He was given a green light. So he had full-on sex with this 14-year-old girl and nothing happened. So what does he learn? He learns that it's okay to do that. And what's going to happen in the future? I guarantee you there will be future problems with this youth pastor. The senior pastor faces prosecution because he's a mandatory reporter and he didn't report it. The church community is now divided. There's half the camp that supports the youth pastor and how wonderful he is. He's so charismatic. He's so got all these baptisms. Look at all that he's done for the church. And by the way, we can drop our kids off for a camporee for the weekend and we can go on our own little vacation and don't have to worry about our kids because they're under the supervision of the youth pastor. The church has financial liability. And one more thing we need to talk about is the relative who was on the decision-making team. I'm sure you've all heard the title of the movie, 6 Degrees of Separation. And the idea was that for everybody you know, you're only 6 people away from finding someone you have in common. And I've heard it jokingly referred to in the Adventist system as 1 degree of separation. Because if you meet someone else who's a stranger and they're an Adventist, you are going to know someone that they know, I promise. So I think we need to be very attuned to the fact that having a relative as a decision maker is not an outlier. I want to ask you what we know about sexual offenders. They're predators and they seek out the vulnerable. So in this case with the youth pastor, he realizes when this girl is wearing sexy clothes and has jewelry and has maybe purple hair, and if the victim has tattoos, this is a good one to go after because nobody in our church is going to believe them. I've used the example before of a lion chasing prey. A lion is a predator. And if he's chasing a pack of antelopes and there's one in the back of the herd that has a limp, who do you think is going to be dinner? Well, this is the same kind of behavior that a sexual predator has. They seek out somebody maybe who's from a single family home, who has a lot of unsupervised time where they're available. They seek out someone who's likely to be disbelieved by the congregation. Maybe somebody who's acting out for other reasons. Maybe there's domestic violence in their own home and they don't know how to deal with it, but they're doubly at prey for a sexual predator. One of the considerations that this church committee made was what they called the he said, she said. And I just want to say that this is kind of like a duh moment because most sex crimes are done in private. People aren't going out on the football field and having sex in front of a big audience. This is all secret stuff. So most crimes are he said, she said. The victim's going to report it, perpetrator's going to deny it. And these are very difficult cases to prove. Sexual offenders are master manipulators, and they're not just going to manipulate you, the church, by saying everything you want to say and being wonderful Christians in every other way, but they're also going to manipulate their victims. And I'm going to tell you a story about a man I prosecuted. He was a single man who lived in an apartment, and he became friends with 4 other teenage boys who lived in the apartment. They all came from different homes, but they all had single parents. They all went to high school and they all had a bunch of free time on their hands in the afternoon. So he started inviting them over to his house and they would watch TV and they would play video games. And it was just like the boys' club where they hung out. And then the next thing he did was introduce alcohol. So now they were all drinking alcohol, getting a little buzzed, watching TV, playing their video games. And the boys' club continued. And then he brought out marijuana. And he's smoking a joint and he passed it around to the other boys in the group. And now they're getting high and they're drinking alcohol and they're playing video games and watching TV. And as the days go by, he introduces pornography. And suddenly the TV doesn't just have TV shows, it has pornography, and they're smoking weed and they're drinking alcohol and they're watching porn. And as the days go by, he steps it up a little bit. And now he starts groping the boys, touching their sexual organs and trying to make sexual moves on them. And at this point, one of the boys was just like, no, we're done here. Told his mother, and it all came to light. And this man ended up getting prosecuted. But I think you can see the manipulation component in that they're afraid to say anything because they're going to have to confess to their parents that they were drinking alcohol, that they were smoking weed, that they were looking at porn. And these are all things that they're going to be embarrassed or ashamed of, that they're not going to want to come to light, but it will come to light. And it did come to light. So they manipulate the situation and they're going to manipulate the people in the congregation. Some convicted sex offenders have even said that a religious community is very easy to manipulate because the people are very in denial about sexual abuse, and it was just like an open field. These people are dishonest. They're boundary testers. For those of you who have teenagers and you give them a 10 o'clock curfew and they don't come home till 10 after 10, they've just learned if you do nothing that their curfew really isn't 10 o'clock. And then in a few days, they come home at 10:30 and now they know their curfew isn't 10:10 anymore. It's now 10:30. And they're just going to keep pushing it and seeing how much they can get away with. And the same is true of a sexual offender. They're going to push the boundaries. You need to know that they can be very charming people. They're very charismatic people. And many Christian molesters will leverage their place within a church to gain access to victims. I read some study, and it's been cited over and over again. If you Googled this, you would find this study. It says 93% of convicted sex offenders say they have religious training or they're part of a religious community. So there it is. Up to 24% of sex offenders will be rearrested for a sexual offense within 5 years. So that's something you need to think about. Oh, one more comment I wanted to make about the 24% is those are cases that were reported. Remember, out of 1,000 cases, the report level is so low that there's a pretty strong likelihood that a sex offender has reoffended and nobody has said anything. So that's not counted in the statistic. Why are sex offenders required to register? Well, the number one reason is public safety, because they want to monitor and track sex offenders to prevent them from harming others. So at least in the law, there's an acknowledgement that children are a very vulnerable population and need to be protected. Have you ever heard of a murderer who had to register? No. I mean, this is a registration specifically for sex offenders because there is such risk for reoffending and because the victims are so vulnerable. The second reason is prevention. They think that public dissemination of this information will help to prevent future victimizations. So there's actually a national website that you can look at to find out who has been convicted of child molestation. Because I'm a weirdo and because I've worked in this arena, my husband and I were singing with a chorus of men and women, adults, and one of the women started bringing her 7-year-old son to the chorus. And because of my background, I decided to go on our little California website and find out if any of our chorus members were child molesters. And I got a hit. One of our chorus members was, in fact, a child molester, which I never would have known about him. I'd sung with him many times, and he was a child molester. And when the child started coming to the chorus, he just kind of dropped out and didn't come back. Well, he was doing the responsible thing because I'm sure he wasn't supposed to be around children. But you just never know. You never know who people are. And I was going to say, for those of you who are big on background checks, you want to not just check the state that you live in, because this national registry will usually divide it by state. But if this person that's coming on board to your school comes from a different state, you might want to check that state as well and see if they're a registered sex offender there. The last reason is community awareness. It allows the community to be aware of their presence and to take precautions. So I just want you to know that you need to know if there are sex offenders in your midst. You need to know. As a church member, would you say it's more important to you to protect children or to make sure that perpetrators get due process? And then I'm going to ask you, is there equal concern about the due process rights of other criminals or only sex offenders? And I'm going to ask you, what is your priority? Is your priority to protect the victim or to protect the reputation of the church? The church being your own little church or your Adventist church, the big Adventist church. So we can talk about that in the chat. The fourth case I'm going to give to you is a scenario involving a church pastor. He's an Adventist pastor, so of course he's married. He has a couple children, and he has a secretary, a female secretary that works in his office. She's friends with his wife. They're in a Bible study together. They trade vegetarian recipes. She's the Pathfinder leader for one of his kids. And she comes into the office one day. She's looking for a file. She can't find it. She sees it on the pastor's desk. He's not there. She goes over to his desk, bumps the mouse on his computer, and a screen comes up with a slideshow of child pornography slides flashing through one after another, children in very compromised positions. It's clearly child pornography. Just something you need to know is that more than 50% of Christian men and more than 20% of Christian women regularly look at pornography. It's not illegal. It's something I've never heard a sermon about, and I've never heard talked about in a Bible study, but maybe it's something we need to talk about. I don't think the Quarterly has many sections upon pornography, but maybe they should. But child pornography is a crime. And the reason is Who do you think is in those images? Who do you think is used for child pornography? These are children who have been sexually trafficked. They're children who have been exploited. It's not like many kids say to their mom, Mom, can I get a note so I can go make some child pornography? These are children who have no one to protect them, and they end up on child pornography sites. They're totally being exploited. There are actually some countries now that refuse to allow their children to be adopted internationally because there had been a lot of unethical practices and exploitation of children from other countries that are just sold basically for sex slaves and turned into child pornographers. What does the church secretary do? Well, you know what she should have done. She should have called the police, but she didn't, because she thought if she reports him, there's a good chance she may lose her job. And I'm sorry to say, but this is a real concern of hers. And I want somebody to explain this to me when we have our discussion later. She's also worried that it's just going to cause a lot of trouble. It's going to disrupt the family. And even if she reports it to the pastor's supervisor or the conference office, nothing is going to be done. I wanted to share a situation that happened when I was working in San Mateo County. Our chief probation officer, who was running the juvenile courts, basically, ended up with child pornography on his computer. And he was arrested and actually was incarcerated. And at his sentencing hearing, he took the case to jury trial, but the jury found him guilty. At his sentencing hearing, he said, the one comment he made that stuck with me was, I realize I'm never going to be given a job again where I will be trusted or I will be placed in a position of trust. So just think about this pastor with the child pornography. Should he be placed in the future in a position of trust? Do we think that our church should do better than was done with a civil servant like a probation officer? Should we hold ourselves to a higher standard? Or because we're the remnant, do we give someone a pass? Someone like this gets a pass. Something to think about. There's also sexual behavior not involving children. A parishioner was raped. 1 in 4 women will be subject to sexual violence in her lifetime. Men are also victims, and there's sometimes even more of a reluctance to report if they've been victimized by a same-sex perpetrator. Most women know they're rapists. It's usually a spouse, an intimate partner, a date rape situation, or an ex-spouse or partner. Medical personnel who treat her injuries must notify law enforcement, but there are no mandatory reporting requirements like there are for children. More sexual behavior not involving children that may present itself at church are pastors who have had sexual or romantic relationships with parishioners. Should a pastor like this expect to be fired? What do you think? Our single women or divorcees pray for church leaders. Someone posted this in one of the chats, and it reminded me of a friend of mine who worked for an Adventist office. And every day she took the money and put it in this vault in a small room in the office. And one day was confronted by a pastor who was working in an office situation. And he started coming after her, sexually groping her. And she was pushing him away and said that she was going to turn him in. And he asked the very pointed question, who do you think they're going to believe, the pastor or the divorcee? Something to think about. Sexual harassment in the workplace, in churches, schools, offices. We have Adventist hospitals, and sexual harassment is rampant there. What are the church's policies, and are they followed consistently? Our goal should be to protect the victim. And are we protective as a herd of elephants? You can see this elephant here, and they're all surrounding this baby. I actually wanted Lauren to put in this slide that he couldn't go. It was a video of a herd of elephants and there was a baby elephant and a predator was coming to their midst, they quickly put the baby in the center of them. And they did something that's called an alert circle, where all the elephants put their tail toward the middle where the baby is with their tusks and faces heading outwards. And they just made the circle around the baby. I want us to have that image in our minds when it comes to protecting children in our church. Is our church as protective as a herd of elephants toward our children? Or for some reason, have we gotten off track and we're more concerned about protecting our church, protecting our pastor? But I think we really need to focus on protecting the victims. There are unique issues that we have in our church because of our patriarchal system. This is an outdated photo. I think some of you will recognize people who are no longer our leaders, but this is a leadership team photo that had been published. Are all decisions in these sexual assault cases male? Are our leaders generally male? Do children and females feel safe making a report? Is there more emphasis on protecting a pastor or a male pastor or a male perpetrator than a child or a female victim? I don't know the answer to that, but it's something we need to discuss. Do male leaders protect the children and women of the church, or do they want to dominate them? I remember being at one of these ATSS seminars where one of the presenters was talking about how many women would not attend the St. Louis General Conference meeting because of bitterness that they had about how women were treated by the church. And I think it's something that we need to be very aware of. And what are we doing about that? The idea of an insular community is people who believe there's a difference between us and them. They may be more prone to keeping it in-house. It's maybe the most attractive option to them because first off, they're afraid of people on the outside. They've lived their entire lives in what my kids call the Adventist bubble, and they don't have any friends outside of the church. There's no place they can go. And if they go there, they don't trust people who are on the outside. So one of the benefits of calling the police is getting it out of the church because everything can't be decided in the church. If you make a report that a child has been sexually abused to your pastor and they keep it in the church, first of all, they've broken the law by not calling the police. But secondly, it becomes a level of scrutiny of whether the church did the fair thing, whether the child got a fair shake or an opportunity to be heard. And it's just easier. If you call the police, you say, and somebody complains, you say, we did what we could, we called the police. Now we're going to talk about the issue of rehabilitated sex offenders. Most churches want to allow convicted sex offenders to rejoin them. And the idea is that Jesus' grace will extend to a sex offender, and you want to welcome them back to the congregation and let them resume their normal lives. This is not unique to Adventist churches. This is most Christian churches want to welcome back sex offenders. So it's always a legal balance. This is a legal balancing act that we learn in law school. What's the social utility of the act? And what's the risk of harm? And the church needs to keep this in mind every minute. You may want to bring this person back, and there may be benefits to this person having Christian fellowship and walking in a new direction and maybe on a new path. But the risk of harm is that they aren't really rehabilitated and that perhaps they're going to be doing the same thing, looking for new opportunities, taking advantage of the fact that they think Christians are easily manipulated. Everyone in the congregation who welcomes back a convicted sex offender who's a required registrant should be told of their history. If you think about the reasons why people are required to register, it's to protect people. As a mother who had children, I would want to know if there was somebody in my congregation who was a registered sex offender, wouldn't you? People may say, well, we wanted to keep it confidential to keep him, to give him the best chance to move forward. but I don't think so. It's not confidential. In fact, the person's a registered sex offender. And if anybody in your congregation decided to go on that national hotline registry and find out who was a registered sex offender in your midst, wouldn't you feel betrayed if nobody had told you that? If the whole church board knew that this person was a registered sex offender, but didn't mention it to kids or parents who had kids in cradle roll or kindergarten or primary classes, come on. I want to give you some ideas about red flags for rehabilitated offenders who may want to rejoin your church. Oftentimes, they will minimize what happened in the past. They may blame the victim. They may paint themselves as a victim. They may say it was all a big family misunderstanding, or maybe they were having a divorce and their family was dysfunctional and their ex put the child up to this. I had a cabin actually in a community. I didn't live there, but I did my usual thing. It was a small little neighborhood, and I checked to see if there were any sex offenders living there. And guess what? There was a sex offender in the neighborhood, lived around the block from me. My kids were adults or in college at this point. And my sister-in-law and brother-in-law also lived there, and their kids were grown up. But this guy kind of ingratiated himself to everybody. When they moved on, he was very, just disclosed that he was a convicted sex offender. But, it was a misunderstanding. There was a family issue, and this child had lied about him. And that was, well, he'd done 8 years in prison, but it was just all a misunderstanding. And I remember thinking at the time, this just does not pass the smell test. And sure enough, down the line, he didn't reoffend sexually, but there were issues that happened that just kind of called his veracity into question in other ways. It's a red flag. When somebody does this, it's just a red flag. Sometimes they don't fully comply with registration rules. They may register as a sex offender, but there may be additional rules that require them to stay away from youth, to not volunteer in a situation where youth are involved, or to not get a job working for the church. They don't get to be a Pathfinder leader. So you need to know what the rules are in your state or in your country. They are going to test the boundaries. They're going to try a little bit here and try a little bit there if they haven't been rehabilitated and they're back on the prowl for more victims. You need to educate your congregation on these red flag issues, and you need to be aware that you may be being manipulated, and open your mind to what other people in your congregation can see that you are not able to see. Can the church do a better job? Well, the church needs to commit time and money to making this church a safe place. I think the church often tries to represent itself as a haven, a safe place for people, that you can trust us. Well, then you need to put your money where your mouth is, and you need to put things in place that guarantee your church is a safe place. Prevention. You need to have education and training of everybody in the pews. You need to talk to kids about safe touches and unsafe touches, private areas that people shouldn't be touching. This should just be a conversation you have. You need to talk with your congregation about what's going to happen if a child molester is revealed, or if somebody's in your midst. You need to check the National Registry for Sex Offenders. We talked about that. New parishioners must be in the church for 6 months or a year before they have access to children. You don't want somebody to show up and become a Pathfinder leader the next week. That's just a bad idea. You need to have policies in place before a crisis occurs, so that when a crisis does occur, you know what to do. And then you need to be consistent in following the policies. There are no pocket vetoes, especially if they're relatives. And there's no wiggle room. You have a policy and you're going to follow it. Mandatory reporters need to know what to do. And it sounds like from the examples that I've given here, there are a lot of mandatory reporters who don't know what to do, or don't know that they have an obligation. So you need to know the laws of your state or your country where you live, because most countries have mandatory reporting requirements. Everyone in the church should know what to do. If a child makes a report of child molest, everybody in the church needs to know what to do. You need to be realistic about who is in your pews. Remember, 1 out of 6 children have been molested, maybe as many as 1 in 4. 1 in 4 women and some men as well have been rape victims. You have perpetrators sitting in your pews, whether you like it or not. You have regular pornography users sitting in your pews. You have people sitting in your pews who have been betrayed by the church based on what's happened in the past. And some of you have shared those stories with me. You need to have contact information for local resources and counselors, hotlines, current and available. You don't want to go and find an old 10-year-old list for a therapist who's not in practice anymore and give that to your victim. It needs to be current information. The victim may be suicidal. You need to have suicide hotline information available. Don't resist getting help outside the church. In fact, one of our participants here made the comment that Christians are more likely to be involved in this type of behavior than non-Christians. So I've heard people say, well, I would only go see a Christian therapist. It's like, okay, well, you know what that means. They're more likely to be a perpetrator than a non-Christian, but it's your call. Don't advise victims to forgive, to get over it, or move on. Basically, what you're saying is, I don't want to talk about this. And the truth is, nobody wants to talk about it. But studies show that victims of sexual crimes are victimized for a much longer period of time than somebody who's just attacked on the street or a victim of a different kind of crime. People who are victims want to be known as survivors. And in fact, most of the cutting edge literature talks about them as survivors and not as victims, as I've done here. So people want to get past this and they want to move on, but they want to hold people accountable. My last slide is one that I saw on Facebook as a Facebook meme. And I want you to think about it. This is something authored by Jennifer Greenberg, who's the author of a book called Not Forsaken. She was physically and sexually abused by her church attending father. She says, reporting an abuser doesn't ruin their life. They did that themselves. This one stopped me in my tracks. Reporting an abuser doesn't damage their reputation. It makes it more accurate. Reporting an abuser doesn't hurt their family. It protects them from abuse. And reporting an abuser isn't gossip, it's integrity. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation.